In the quiet hours before dawn, Portsmouth's streets take on the same sleepy, unfinished feel as any small coastal city. Shop shutters rattle in the wind. Fishermen stack crates along the harbour, and an occasional dog walker cuts through the square. For most residents, the last thing on their minds is the crack and heroin trade being run into town from London, manned not by hardened cartel figures, but by boys barely old enough to drink. Yet that is exactly what had been happening. A pattern of exploitation so stark it would go on to shape how Britain prosecutes county lines. This is the story of the Fly Line, the name given by one of its operators, and the three men who ran it. The story of how a London-based network recruited children, threaded them into a system of supply and violence, and was eventually dismantled and convicted under the Modern Slavery Act. It is a story about the thin line between criminal choice and coercion, and about how an ordinary phone number became a pipeline for exploitation. County lines didn't invent a new drug economy. They repurposed old practices for a modern age. A single phone number, advertised on social media, whispered in local bars, passed by users hungry for product, became the storefront. Call that number, place an order, and the runner arrives with pre-packaged wraps of crack or heroin. The model was simple, scalable, and chillingly efficient. A small city could be serviced by runners who arrived from London, executed multiple drops, and vanished on the next train home. In the Fly Line's case, prosecutors showed the court how messages and daily rhythms revolved around a London number. It had what the defendants called a brand identity, a name that regular customers could recognise even when numbers were swapped. The line handlers in London, the organisers who coordinated pickup, packaging and travel, had mapped a simple logistics chain. Supply moved from London. Runners did the deliveries. Cash returned to handlers, and the numbers rotated when police pressure mounted. This basic playbook was repeated in dozens, then hundreds, of county lines across Britain. What set this case apart, and what made the charges so weighty, was the human machinery behind the logistics. The Fly Line did not rely entirely on adult willing dealers. Instead, it recruited a ring of teenagers and vulnerable young adults, some as young as 14. Prosecutors later described how these children were moved from London to Portsmouth to work the streets. They were stocked in cheap bedsits, told where to stand, told what time to call, and told where the drop spots were. When they returned, they handed over cash or turned in product to be redistributed. The money they made seemed dazzling to them, enough, the court heard, to buy trainers, clothes, and respect, and it was also what made them dependent. But dependency in this world was not only psychological. The Crown's case described methods of control that moved beyond simple economic enticement. One victim told police he had been stripped naked by associates of one defendant, had a gun placed in his mouth, and was threatened with death if he didn't comply. Other recruits were billeted in the rundown flats of known drug users, a grim form of cuckooing that turned vulnerable homes into dealing bases. These stories were central to the prosecution's argument that this was not mere teenage offending, but modern slavery by another name. The systematic use of people's vulnerability to run a profitable operation. The legal arc of the Fly Line case is important because it shows how prosecutors had to adapt their approach to county lines. Initial drug investigations led to convictions for supply as far back as 2016. But the trafficking allegations, applying the Modern Slavery Act to those who exploited children as couriers, required a different set of evidence and a longer timeline. The Crown had to prove not only that drugs had been supplied, but that offenders had recruited, transported, or housed children for the purpose of exploitation. That is a higher bar. Jurors were shown call data, witness statements, and testimony from the young people themselves. The timeline in court stretched across years. The offences began in the mid-2000s, and the trafficking charges were not resolved until 2019. Part of the delay was the complicated legal question of whether the teenagers were victims forced into crime or perpetrators who made choices to be involved. The prosecution argued that the way the young people had been moved, isolated, threatened, and controlled met the threshold of trafficking and exploitation. The convictions were a legal landmark. 3 men found guilty of human trafficking for county lines activity, a precedent for later cases. Reading the court documents is like looking down at a map of the gang's operations. Phone pings showed the same London devices lighting up cell towers in Portsmouth on dealing days. CCTV in provincial towns tracked the entry and exit of the runners. The court saw bank deposits and cashier receipts linked to drug runs. Testimony detailed the brand names used for the lines, each a marketing play to sustain returning customers when numbers were changed. Those pieces of evidence, assembled, became the skeleton of a modern trafficking prosecution. In testimony, victims described the daily routines, the times they were to arrive at certain benches, the visible ways they had to mark territory, the quick handoffs. The jury also heard the stories of violence and intimidation. That mosaic, data, sightlines, and testimony, allowed jurors to understand that this was not ad hoc delinquency, but a structured, replicable criminal business. The legal framing that finally stuck was not simply they sold drugs, it was they used vulnerable people to do it. When the sentences were handed down in 2019, they were headline news. The 3 convicted men received custodial terms, various years each, with the longest sentences reflecting both the scale of supply and the trafficking findings. Judges made it clear in their remarks that the use of children and the presence of coercion and violence justified the weight of the punishment. Sentencing in the Flyline case sent a message: exploitative county lines activity would not merely be catalogued as drug distribution, but could be prosecuted as human trafficking, with the full force of modern slavery laws applied. But sentencing was only one part of the aftermath. For the young people who had been inside the network, life after court was messy. Some were prosecuted for the delivery acts themselves, before later being recognized as exploited victims. Others entered support programs. The gap between criminalization and protection, whether police and social services treat a 15-year-old dealer as a defendant or as someone who needs safeguarding, remained a live policy debate. The Flyline story helped change that conversation, nudging the criminal justice system and child welfare services towards greater recognition that some offending is the product of coercion. The significance of the Flyline case, Wabelua and his co-defendants, rippled beyond one sentence. It was a legal turning point that offered prosecutors a blueprint for using modern slavery legislation in county lines prosecutions. It also forced public agencies to reimagine how to respond to offending by children entangled in drug supply. More joint working between police and social care, more emphasis on safeguarding, and more resources for outreach. The case illustrated, too, a hard truth, that some of the people appearing before the courts were both perpetrators and victims, a duality the justice system has struggled to process. Media coverage at the time highlighted the brutality of the methods used and the human vulnerability of the children involved. Advocacy groups and policy leads used the moment to call for expanded funding for rescue services and more specialist prosecutors to tackle the complex interplay of drugs and exploitation. The Flyline became shorthand for an entire class of crime that had been hiding in plain sight. After the Flyline convictions, future operations drew on the lessons it taught. National initiatives like Operation Orochi and large cross-force task forces ramped up activity to identify and close lines, safeguard victims, and pursue organizers. Policing shifted towards data analysis, mapping mobile numbers, travel patterns, and financial flows, and towards partnership work with social services and charities to ensure that children identified as runners were offered protection, not only prosecution. But the trade adapted as well. Political commentators and policing reports noted that even when specific lines were closed, the structural conditions that fueled recruitment, lack of jobs, poverty, fractured family systems, and the lure of quick money remained. The Flyline case was instructive because it exposed both a criminal method and a social problem. The law could lock up organizers and seize cash. It could not, by itself, rebuild the fragile ecosystems that allowed children to be groomed. Reading the interviews with the young people involved is the most wrenching part of the story. They speak of the initial lure: a phone, some cash, the chance to look older, to buy expensive trainers, to feel wanted. They describe how little things, a cigarette given here, a meal there, built loyalty. Then they describe the squeeze, how refusal led to threats, how not returning money meant physical punishment, how the network's bosses remained faceless except by a voice on a burner phone. One former recruit, later supported by outreach charities, said the first trip out of London felt like an adventure. These testimonies underline the paradox. The same streets that produced exploitation also contain the workers trying to protect youngsters. The Flyline story, in its human detail, is as much a story of failure as of conviction, a catalogue of the things that allowed the exploitation to happen in the first place. If the Flyline taught one lesson, it was that the criminal law has tools to catch county lines, but that the solution must be plural. Enforcement matters. Successful prosecutions remove organizers and can deter networks, but prevention and protection are equally critical. Early intervention with vulnerable children, support for families, education programs that offer alternatives, and economic policies that reduce the appeal of getting paid cash for running drugs. When the judge in the Flyline case pronounced sentence, it was more than a personal reckoning for the defendants, it was a public signal. The court's language underlined that exploiting children for profit, even in the name of a drug business, would be treated as trafficking. For victims, the verdict was vindication. For policymakers, it was a wake-up call. For other gangs, it was a threat. The law had sharpened its tools. Yet the last line of this story is not a courtroom pronouncement. It is the quiet, steady work of those in the wards, in the schools and in the voluntary groups who meet young people before they are recruited, who listen, who provide safe places, and who slowly begin to unpick the conditions that make phone numbers into pipelines of exploitation.